Well, welcome everyone. Today we are going to talk about working memory. And as Jackie said, this is a time of the year where we find ourselves being pulled in many different directions. So we may find that our memory appears to be impacted. I know this morning I was actually thinking about this, about how for several days now, I've been trying to remember the name of this, excuse me, of this store that my son really likes in the mall for Christmas presents, and for the life of me could not remember it. And then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, I remembered it this morning. So we may ask ourselves, like, why is it that sometimes we just can't remember things that we know and times we remember it without really trying. So we're going to talk about some of that today. We're going to talk a little bit about different types of memory, specifically our working memory, and what impacts our memory and how we can even make it a little bit better. So that being said, we'll get started. So let's start off by talking about what is cognition. So cognition refers to the mental actions and processes involved in thinking and planning and sustained focus and information processing. So it really encompasses how we acquire, how we store, how we manipulate, and how we use information to understand and to interact with the world around us. There's 6 different types of cognition, and we don't have enough time to go into all of these in detail, so I'll run through them relatively briefly. The 6 main types of cognition include attention, which is our ability to stay focused on something. It includes executive functioning, which is our ability to plan and to make decisions and to remember information needed to do a task and to respond flexibly to that task. I'm sure you've heard this term in relation to individuals with ADHD or attentional problems, because executive functioning tends to be the one area of cognition that's impacted by that. Learning and memory, of course, is the ability to remember and recall information in both the short and long term. Language is our ability to express ourselves with the right language and think of the right words. Perceptual motor skills is the ability to make sense of the world around us, of visual and other sensory information, such as sounds, smells, from other people in the world around us. Perceptual motor is oh, I already did that. I'm sorry. Social cognition is the ability to make logical judgment about other people. So to understand what maybe other people's intentions are, what their wishes are, and to control our own emotions in a socially appropriate way. Let's talk about some everyday examples. So when we think about remembering, say, a phone number long enough to either dial it on our phone or to write it down in our book, that's an example of cognition. Planning your day or solving a problem at work, understanding and responding appropriately when you're having conversations with people. Those are different everyday examples. So what exactly then is working memory in relation to that? Well, working memory is a cognitive system with a limited capacity, and that's key here. Limited capacity that can hold information temporarily. So it's our ability to maintain and manipulate small amounts of information in our mind over a short period of time. So if we think about working memory as a filing cabinet that holds a few documents, let's say about 7 for a brief period, that can range anywhere from a few seconds to a few minutes, depending on the task and depending on our own cognitive ability. If any of these documents, though, are revisited, so we pull them out of that file cabinet a lot, then they tend to then be stored in long-term memory. So the brain is constantly multitasking, and working memory is fragile because that constant multitasking can compete with our working memory. So an easy example here is when someone tells you a phone number, you repeat it to yourself. That we talked about this earlier. That's working memory because we're repeating it to ourselves, but we want to do something with those numbers. We're not just saying, oh, it's this, this, and this. We want to do something. We want to put it in our contact list. Maybe we want to write it down. So it's kind of like a mental sticky note. We think about working memory in action. It's that holding and manipulating of information. So it lets us work with information in a very brief amount of time, such as mental arithmetic or remembering instructions, those types of things. Working memory also enables us to juggle multiple ideas simultaneously while making complex problem solving and decision making even possible for us. It also improves our concentration and helps us respond quickly to new learning and everyday challenges. So again, it allows us to temporarily hold and manipulate information. So let's imagine that you're at home and your phone rings, and a friend calls and he or she gives you a new address over the phone. So for example, 123 Maple Street, apartment 4B. You don't have a pen nearby, so you repeat the address in your mind as you walk to your, say, your computer or your phone, and you start typing in this information. This is working memory at work. It's holding on to that address just long enough for you to complete the task despite distractions. So say your dog is barking outside, or, maybe your phone is buzzing while you're trying to put it in your computer, or another message is coming through. The problem here, though, is if you get interrupted, chances are you're going to forget that information, right? But if you successfully get it where you need it, then you've done it. Your working memory has done its job. So again, it's like a sticky note. It's a skill that lets us work with the information without losing track. But keeping in mind that kids and adults who learn and think differently often struggle with working memory. So, for example, it's not uncommon for somebody who has a diagnosis of attention deficit disorder or ADHD to also have a working memory deficit. So what's the difference between short-term memory, working memory, and long memory? So we look at short-term memory. It's storage of information for a very brief amount of time, which will be forgotten if it's not rehearsed. Long-term memory, though, on the other hand, is memories that the brain has stored over an extended amount of time. And there's two different types. There's procedural, which is information related to activities that are learned through practice and repetition. For example, driving your car. And there's declarative long-term memory, which tends to be information about facts, rules, events, maybe even definitions and experiences that you can recall when needed. So working memory in the middle is the temporary storage of information that we're actually manipulating in our memory at the time. And it helps to organize the information when it's coming from short-term memory to be able to then move it into long-term memory or long-term storage. So how does working memory work in the brain? The front part of your brain, or the frontal cortex, helps you focus and think, and the hippocampus helps you store and find those memories. And these two parts work together like musicians in an orchestra that help you remember things. So when you remember, for example, where your keys are, so they all these things come together to help us do that. So I'm going to do this briefly. I'm not really sure what happened to this slide here, but the brain's file cabinet, this is what I call an analogy with our working memory. So imagine that your brain is the file cabinet. So the labels are like tabs that help you find the right file, and the instructions are like the map that shows you exactly where to look. So some of our brain cells act as labels. They help us quickly find things, and other act as, but together, like that orchestra coming together, these cells coordinate your brain's memory systems, making it easier for you to remember important details for everything that we do. So for example, the keys. So when you remember where you left your keys, your brain's labels and instructions work together to help you figure that out. So again, that working memory is repeated and and continued exposure where you're moving information from that short term into the long term if needed, or just enough time to get it where you need it to go. And it helps solidify new information at a neural level, which then encodes it in that hippocampus. So what are some things that impact memory? We had talked about us going over this. So what impacts memory is, what are we trying to do? What's the task at hand? Is it simple? Is it complicated? Is it somewhere in the middle? Everybody also has different cognitive abilities. So some people have, let's just face it, better memories than others. Some people are able to process information more quickly than others. Another thing that impacts memory is chunking, or whether we can organize the information in chunks in our brain. Memory training can impact memory, and that can be as simple as crossword puzzles or Sudoku or anything like that, where you're constantly using your brain. The next one is one that people underestimate, and that is sleep. Sleep has a huge impact on memory. And you will find that if you've had a really poor night's sleep, you're going to notice that your memory the next day is not going to be as good as it usually is. So I can't stress that enough, that people just don't realize that impact. Anxiety and depression also impact memory fairly significantly as well. Your mind is so busy trying to deal with the anxiety and the depression that there isn't a whole lot left for the memory. And of course, stress kind of falls hand in hand with that. And then the older you are, of course, the more impact it has on your memory. The older you are, the worse your memory is going to be. Research does show, as I just talked about, that mental health issues can significantly impact cognition in several ways, through impaired attention, memory, impaired information processing, decision making. Decreased cognitive flexibility is a big one. We talked about that in regards to executive functioning, and then of course decreased executive functioning. I'm going to go over 3 cases here. These are famous case studies that really show us that how brain injury impacts working memory, and how it impacts it differently depending on the part of the brain that's injured. So the first case is called, maybe some of you have heard of him, Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage was a railroad worker who survived a severe brain injury, and I want to say it's 1848, when an iron rod penetrated his skull and damaged his frontal lobes. And after the accident, Gage's personality and behavior changed dramatically. And where it really impacted was his ability to plan. It impacted his impulse control and especially working memory tasks. So this case highlights the role of the frontal lobe in these cognitive functions, and how important the frontal lobe is when it comes to the executive functioning and those types of things. Another patient is HM, or Henry. I want to say it's Molaison, but please forgive me if I pronounce that wrong. HM underwent surgery to treat epilepsy. And I'm actually dealing with a true life case of this right now as well. And this surgery involved removing parts of his medial temporal lobes. So after surgery, so this isn't the frontal, this is the medial, HM could not form new long-term memories, but was able to retain short-term memory and working memory abilities. So only his long-term memory was impacted. And this case shows the distinction between working memory and long-term memory systems. And then finally, patient KF. KF suffered brain damage from a motorcycle accident, specifically affecting the parietal lobe. Okay, so this is the parietal. But unlike HM, KF's long-term memory remained intact, but his working memory, especially for verbal information, was severely impaired. So this case demonstrates that different brain regions support different types of memories. these cases are often cited in neuroscience and psychology to illustrate how specific brain injury can disrupt our working memory and and it helps make this memorable to us so we can act these case studies that it has on memory. So what are some ways that we can boost working memory? Well, we can chunk information, which is breaking it down into smaller chunks, because this makes it easier for us to manage and recall. We can engage in brain training activities such as puzzles or memory games, which also stimulate our cognitive functioning and support improvement. Healthy lifestyle habits are a big one. Adequate sleep, balanced diet, physical activity. These are all essential for optimal brain performance and memory retention. And then finally, mnemonics and acronyms. And this is creating associations for easier recall. And the example I always like to use here is, I'm older, so when I was younger, we were trying to learn the scales for music. We were always taught, face for the spaces, and every good boy does fine for the line. So it helps you remember that. So that's like those mnemonics that we use to help us remember things. I'm sure you can think of some that you have used to help you remember things as well. Songs, for example, those types of things. So another thing that we don't realize that can also help our memory are certain types of nutrition. So turmeric supplements will help. Polyunsaturated fatty acids, including omega-3 fatty acids. I'm sure everyone's heard of that. This is basically healthy fat, which can be found in plants and animal foods, such as salmon, vegetable oils, some nuts and seeds. Polyphenols and micronutrients polyphenols are micronutrients that naturally in vegetables and teas and spices. This is one that a lot of people don't realize does have an impact on memory, and that's intermittent fasting. There are people who will swear by this, that if you fast after a certain number of hours, an individual's memory will get it better, will improve. And I actually did this presentation for a small group, and there was a woman in that group that does do this fasting, and she swears by that difference of when she gets past that certain number of hours. I want to say it's maybe 8 or 10. She is then able to remember things better. Caloric restriction, again, can also help. But there's also some foods that also negatively impact our memory, and that's those high fat and high sugar diets. So we often hear about, stay away from high fat diets, stay away from high sugar diets because of what it does on us physically. What we don't realize is that those things also impact us on a mental level. So they impact our cognition or our ability to remember things. So if you sit back, you can think about some times when maybe you've ingested a lot of high fat or high sugar food, and your brain is just kind of fuzzy. Anybody recall times like that? So we can start paying attention to it from here. All right, so that being said, I know I would like to open it up for some questions or even a discussion. And I know, Jackie, I believe you wanted to end the recording.
Yes, ma'am. I'm going to stop the recording right now.